And we're live. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another Stripe Dev Chats. So the last time, maybe not the last time, like 2 streams ago, we had Chris here, and he was on. He was talking to us about how he extended Rails using his pay extension, and showed us how he could, accept payments inside of a Ruby on a Rails app. And we got so much good feedback from it, and I feel like the conversation wasn't done yet. So we had to have him come back on, and we're going to dive a little bit deeper. We're going to go under the covers a little bit and see, well, how exactly did he even make this extension, and what are some of the things that you need to do if you want to make your own extension too. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about how you can extend Rails using engines. And I'm super curious about it. I'm not a Ruby person. CJ, I know you've done a little bit of Ruby, so maybe you might have more context than I do. But again, always interested to seeing how like different communities and different frameworks like do things. So, Chris, why don't you, like, super quick, again, I know probably most folks already know who you are. Why don't you super quick just go ahead and introduce yourself again and let folks know who you are and what do you do?
Sure. I'm Chris Oliver. I run GoRails, Hatchbox, and Jumpstart Pro, and a bunch of open source gems. For Ruby on Rails developers, make screencasts, app templates with SaaS templates, and hosting stuff. So just kind of a wild variety of different Ruby on Rails related things. So that's me.
So I guess what you're saying is if I wanted to learn Ruby, like you are the person that I should learn it from. Like that's what I'm hearing right now.
Hopefully, yeah. We have mostly Rails related stuff, but actually, we're going to be doing some like beginner Ruby content and stuff like that too. So, plenty of things to learn. There's like 450 some videos now on GoRails, so it's a lot. It's been a lot.
That's amazing. Okay, so I want you to hold that thought because I want us to talk about it. But before we do that, I want to dive into some highlights. We always try and do, in the beginning of Dev Chats, if this is your first time here, we usually try and look at some of the cool things that have been happening in the community over the past year. So let's do this super quick, and then after that, we can dive into talking about engines. All right, so first thing I want to mention to folks. So if you don't know, we have a Stripe developers channel. I know some of y'all are watching us on YouTube, but we're also on Twitch, and I think we might be actually even on Twitter today. We have a lot of different channels that we stream from. But if you're watching and you still haven't subscribed to the channel, I'd love for you to do that. We have tons of amazing videos. And even specifically next month, what's interesting is that we're going to do the entire month of September focused on something we have called checkout. And if you're not familiar, checkout, in my opinion, is one of the easiest ways that you could use to get started with payments. So for the entire month of September, we're going to have like different advocates, companies. We're going to have some engineers, some PM folks. CJ is going to be there. I'm going to be there. We're going to look at some Ruby stuff, some .NET stuff. Right? We're going to spend the entire month talking about checkout. So hopefully y'all join us next month. And again, if you're just getting started with Stripe, I think it's a great place for us to start. The next thing I want to highlight for you folks, if you head over to dev.to, a lot of our team, write blogs, articles, and stuff like that over at dev.to. Our teammate Paul has an interesting post called "Purchase Fulfillment with Checkout," or wait, what was it that I paid for? So pretty much what he's talking about is after you've collected money, right? Like after you've collected your payment through Stripe, what do you do, right? Like what's the process after that? And he kind of walks through, after you've gotten your like successful paid event, like, how can I get like the line items? You know what I mean? How can I kick off some background process? Like, what's some of the recommended ways for us to kind of handle some of these things using Stripe webhooks? So again, this is over on dev.to under the Stripe organization. I think they call them organizations in dev.to. Is that what they call CJ, or groups or whatever?
I think so. Yeah, I just dropped a link too, so you should see that in the chat if you want to head over and take a look at that article. One of the biggest gotchas with checkout is when you receive the checkout session completed webhook notification, the event payload does not include the line item. So you have to turn around and retrieve the checkout session and expand those line items. This is like one of the most common questions we hear. It's designed like this so that we can make that API really performant for everyone. And so if you're wondering, like, wait a second, like, how do I get the product or the price that was purchased with checkout? This is the article for you for sure.
Yeah, so definitely go ahead and head over to dev.to under our Stripe organization, and you can learn about that over there. Also, super quick. So, we love advocates from like all kinds of other companies too. So I want to highlight some of the other things some folks are working on. Our friends over at Okta/Auth0 are doing a dev day. So this essentially is like a little mini DevRel tour. It looks like they're going all over the place. They're going to Seattle and Sydney and London and Berlin. Probably some more countries that might pop in there too. I don't know. Maybe we'll see what happens. But essentially, they're doing like hands-on workshops and meet and greets and really just giving folks the ability to like be in person and work with the team and kind of learn about some of the different things that are happening within the space of authentication. Because as you can imagine, Auth0/Okta, they're an auth company and they do those types of things. So if you're interested, or if you're in one of these cities, or maybe you want to go to one of these cities for vacation, definitely go ahead and check this out. I think this could be a really interesting thing because I can't imagine a website or application that does not need auth. I mean, you might need less auth than some people do, but like I think we pretty much all need like some level of security for stuff. So definitely go ahead and check out Dev Day. And the last thing I want to talk about, what I'm most excited about, I'm not going to lie about it. I'm not going to hide my excitement. The Caribbean Developers Conference is happening November 3rd through 5th. It's going to be in Punta Cana, the Dominican Republic. We have a few Stripes that are going. Myself, I'm going, and also my teammates, Mike is also going as well. So, we're going to be doing some workshops and some talks about Stripe. And also we're going to have some little behind the scenes things that are happening, like, little thought leadership sessions and stuff like that we're going to work on. Really just trying to, reach out and kind of show folks like really what's possible. And on top of that too, I think this is a really great lineup of speakers. There's a lot of amazing folks that are coming, a lot of representation from tons of different companies. And so hopefully y'all will join us and, we'll have a good time down in the Dominican Republic. Now, that being said, this is the part where I say, this is no longer the Cecil show. And now this is all about Chris. So why don't we start talking about engines? So engines. I know what gems are. I know what plugins are. At least I think I know what plugins are. I'm assuming plugins are like universally generic, right? Throughout whatever programming language you are. But I kind of feel like engines are something different. Like, are they different? Are they the same thing? Are they like some hierarchy of like relationship? Like what are they and like how do they work?
Yeah. A Ruby gem, just for anybody that's not familiar, like is just a Ruby library of code that you can access and use and take advantage of. And then a Rails engine is specific to Rails and gives your Rails app features, and it can do stuff automatically because it knows that it's a Rails app. So you might write a Ruby gem that can do, time calculations or something, but it may not have any idea about where you're using it, or it doesn't need to. But if you want to do something like Pay, where we want to provide database models and webhook processing and background jobs and things like that, then it helps to have something like a Rails engine so that we can integrate deeply into your application and take advantage of all the features of Rails that we know are there and exist and don't have to be inside of your code. So that's kind of the difference between like it is a Rails engine is a Ruby gem, but it knows all this context about Rails and what Rails can do for you. So we can really integrate out of the box and have everything ready to go without wiring up things manually for you. Does that make sense?
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. When I think about a gem, then I'm thinking about, I don't know, a library that does a specific thing. Like, hey, I need, I don't know, a QR code thing or a password capture. And then I'm going to call into that function to do some work for me. Versus an engine, if I'm not mistaken, is like an add-on, right? That just does some extra things. And I just have to add it on. And then that functionality is already essentially like wired up. And I don't have to be as involved in the process from a developer perspective. Yeah?
Yep. So like a good example of that is the webhook routes in Pay. When you install the Pay gem, we'll automatically add the routes for you to your Rails app. So you don't have to do anything. You just get these Pay webhooks /Stripe, and voila, you're good to go. So there's no setup for that. It just is automatic. You could turn it off or customize it, of course, but it knows you got a Rails app, so we can add those routes in and be, off to the races with no code written yourself, which is great.
Got it. Okay. Well, yeah. Well. How do we want to do this? Are we gonna write a gem from scratch, or like a engine from scratch, or do you have like a sample that we could take a look at and kind of walk through?
Yeah, we could. So I was gonna pull up the Rails guides real quick and show, this is the place to go if you want to like read more in depth about them and all of that stuff.
Okay.
There's a few different options that you can do, such as a mountable one, or a full Rails engine. And there's also another thing I should mention. There's what's called a rail tie as well, which is like a smaller engine. So the rail tie will integrate with Rails, but it won't provide like in a way, a Rails engine is like a miniature Rails app that you can put in any other Rails app. And the rail tie is kind of you can build a plugin to Rails without the app folder. So no routes, well, you could probably do routes if you want, but no like controllers and models and things. So it's kind of a lighter weight version of that. So yeah, I would recommend, check out the guides on here for always getting the latest ones, but it's going to work very similar to a regular Rails engine or a Rails application. So let me actually pull up in a different window here real quick.
And then as you're saying that, so I'm thinking, if I already know how to build a Rails app, then I already know how to build an engine for the most part.
Pretty much. Yeah, okay. There are a lot of little things that you will, learn as you go, but there is, we'll just copy this example, but we'll see like we'll do a full version of this. What we'll see is like a lot of standard stuff that you would in a normal Rails app. So, let's go into Lorg and pull that up. But you'll see a lot of stuff that's pretty standard. You've got your app folder with inside of it assets, controllers, helpers, jobs, mailers, models, and views, just like you would with a regular Rails app. So it's a nice way to kind of blend your Rails app with some reusable code that you want to put in multiple apps. Like the PayGem, we want payments in a bunch of Rails apps, so we can just drop it in and all of this stuff can like live side by side, but it's all hidden away inside the library or the Rails engine. So that's pretty awesome. And the way that it works is you've got a Ruby gem. So your Ruby gem has a definition of a set of files that it is going to include. And the default generated here is everything in the app directory, config, db, and lib, and all the files underneath them. And it will automatically load the file with the name of your gem. So our module blorg here will be loaded, and it will load this file, and it will load the version, and then the engine, which is the Rails engine. So this is an empty file that just says, hey, we're going to define a Rails engine, and then Rails knows how to keep track of all of those when they're loaded and fire off any of the callbacks. So there's a lot of times where you might build something where, for example, in Pay, we have a Pay customer method. And actually, let's dig into that real quick. I'll show you that in Pay itself, when we go to the Pay engine, we have these initializers and other callbacks that we can set up. So for example, when the Pay engine loads, we can initialize our payment processors, and we can set up the routes automatically and say, hey, we're going to mount the Pay engine routes to a certain location. And that's pay by default. That will add /pay/webhook/stripe and set everything up for us. But we can also do some other things like when Active Record loads, we can include a module to add features to Active Record database models automatically. So this is just a little thing that says, hey, we're going to sit around and wait for that to load. And Rails has a specific order of loading your Rails application and the engines, and then It will go and load certain files and folders in a specific order. So this is going to make sure that if we ever reloaded our application in development, it would also reload and make sure the pay attributes are in there too. And that's basically how we add if we go into that file, I don't know, it's going to jump to it for us, but that is here under attributes. That is just a concern that we include in there and gives you there it is, the pay customer method, which you drop into your user model or your account model or whatever it is. And those can say, hey, we're going to include other things. We're going to set some variables and whatever else we might want to do. But that's one of the ways you can use an engine to hook into different parts of the Rails loading process, which is cool.
So quick question then for you. So if an engine is just like an additional Ruby app, I'm sorry, a Rails app, technically, like, is there any concern around performance when it comes to me? I don't know, let's say I added like 5 engines to my app, or like what are the limitations? What are the things that should be concerned about from a performance perspective as I'm like adding these things to my app or even developing my own?
Yeah. Rails in general is pretty good about that because of the autoloader, and now Ziteworks Amazing as the default autoloader. So all of your typical controllers or models and any of that will be loaded whenever it's referenced. So it doesn't actually get loaded immediately, which is nice. So performance isn't really something you have to worry about too much unless you are writing a lot of requires and doing things manually in your code. You might actually load all these files and it would slow down booting up Rails pretty bad. So all of these kind of stick to using the Rails conventions, and having those things auto-loaded for you will basically make it all work like your Rails app normally would, which is nice. So you wouldn't really run into any performance things like that unless you were kind of, loading lots of stuff individually. So it's nice, like when these, for example, that engine include that we had here. So whenever active record is loaded, we include this. This is going to just say, hey, run this whenever. We'll set it up to run later on. And we don't ever really know when active record gets loaded. So it's lazily executed and just queues it up to be ready whenever Rails or your application loads active record. It's lazily executed. So it's not going to run the code right away, which is good. So helps with boot time and things like that.
Okay. So super quick question coming in from Pierre in YouTube. And this is somewhat related to what we're talking about right now. And that is, so an engine is sort of a microservice outside of our app. And I'd guess the answer is no, but I'll let you answer that real quick.
Yeah, you can think of it as a microservice in a way, but it's going to live and run just like it's as if this code was in your Rails app, like everything else you would have written yourself. So it's really not a separate service. It runs all together with your Rails app. All the routes, the controllers, everything are treated the same. So it's not running separately. So it's not really a microservice, but it's a way to put it in a container and, make it a separate thing that you can think about and reason about as its own module that you can take and reuse in different places and things like that. So you can treat it like that, where you're thinking about it separately, but it's really not a separate, service or anything.
Okay. And then I think my follow-up question to that would be, so you just showed a little bit how, you could kind of plug into like the boot up sequence there a little bit. Is it a case that as I'm building my Rails engine, I'm guessing like there's different lifecycle hooks and events and other things that I could kind of tap into that's a part of my main application, and now the engine can just be like, okay, I want to run at when this thing happens, or when that thing happens, or at this particular, I don't know, event or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, and a perfect example of that is this block right here, where when you are in development, Rails will periodically reload files when they get changed. So you don't have to reboot your application for changes. And this to prepare block will get called when those things change. So this, if we reloaded the pay stripe module and it lost our API keys or whatever, this would get called every time that it's reloaded, and it would make sure that everything is set up correctly. And that's kind of the same thing here. We're just setting a callback to say, hey, anytime you reload active record, make sure that the pay attributes are in there. There's a common issue that a lot of people will do the first time around is you will, when the Rails engine boots, you'll include this module in active record just the first time. But when it reloads, it will clear everything out and reload it. And you need this to happen the second time and third time and fourth time, because if you don't do that, your code will work for a few minutes. You'll save something, it will reload, and then it's broken. And so you need to make sure that you hook into the lifecycle events like that in order to make sure that, you know, your extensions are actually going to be there permanently. The initializers are ones that are just something that happens when it boots up. So it runs one time and you're good to go. For example, we don't want to add routes every single time the Rails app reloads because we would end up with duplicates. So we just do them once here instead of, you know, on a lifecycle kind of callback. And there are a lot of various different things that you can do. I know that the Notice gem that I built uses a similar thing, but it uses a where was that? There is somewhere in here that it will actually like extend the eager load paths so that, or that was in Madman, I bet. It will actually add new paths to look in the folders for different files. So here we run before your Rails app is fully configured. We'll add some files and folders to the load path to look for auto loading files for you. So that's an example of another callback that you might want to hook into for different things.
Okay, that makes sense. So if I know Ruby, I could write an engine. And like you said, I can plug into these different event hooks, and now I could just, you know, I could extend to like my heart's content. I'm curious now about like in your experience, because you know, like you said, pay is like uses or is an engine, right, or something like that. And you've been developing it for a while. What are some of the things that you've seen that you're like, oh, okay, this is important for people that are building engines to know about, so that I know you don't, you know, run into a lot of problems later down the road?
Yeah. I think the biggest one for me has been the database migrations, because originally pay was designed where you had a model and you would include pay onto it, and it might be your user and you want to have the user pay for things. We would have you go add fields to your user model. And that was fine for a while, but as we needed to change those things, it became a really hard maintenance thing for us to change, because you've written migrations that have added things to your models. We don't know which models they are, so we have to keep track of them somehow. So there was some code that was like monitoring for that stuff, and it just is really tricky for you to go and apply your code to models, database models that you don't control. So one of the examples there that was bad was like, if we need to add a new feature, like another field, you had to, as a user, upgrade pay and then go run a migration yourself. And there's really no step that tells you, hey, this new version needs this change, unless you're reading the change log. And that's not something that people always do. So they'll learn it the hard way when things break, when they upgrade the version, and then add, you know, issues asking like, why did this break? And you have to explain it. And it's just like a painful process there to maintain that. So you don't want to do that. And then the other thing is, if you're using these models that you don't know about, you have to figure out how to keep track of them somehow. So for pay, for a while, I had set up a thing where any class that you would use that included pay, we'd keep track of that every time. And then when a webhook would come in, we would say, a subscription was created for somebody, and we'd have to query the users table, the accounts table, the teams table, whatever models you had, and it could be 15 if you wanted. So we would have to do this like multiple database queries trying to find the correct record, and that wasn't great either. And I realized that Rails has a good pattern for this, and they do this in several of their own Rail ties. So when you go to, or let's go to rubygems.org, Rails gems, Rails, yeah. So Rails itself is dependent on a bunch of engines itself. So Action Cable and Action Mailbox and so on are all Rails engines. And if we look at like Action Text, and we can go to GitHub and see that Rails, and we go to Action Text, it's going to have an engine file in here as well. So even the core Rails features themselves are Rails engines, which is pretty neat. But this one is one that has database models in it. So inside of app, we have models, action text, and we have these 3 different models. So it's great because if you are writing an engine, you can create your own models and control everything about them. So as a user of action text, I know that these database tables and records all exist, but it really discourages me from modifying them because they're kind of hidden away inside the gem, which is good. So the maintainers of the gem can make their updates to it and trust that it's not going to be heavily modified by the users of your Rails engine. So that's beneficial for upgrades in the future because you can add migrations. The users still have to add those migrations to their application as you update your versions, but it's much easier because they don't have to touch any code and modify that because your new version ships with all the code. The only thing they have to do is change the migrations. So that was probably the biggest like pain point of working on pay and trying to get that in a more easily maintained state because it's troubling to try to maintain that and have users modify their database in sync with your changes, and it's much easier to kind of control it all inside your engine itself. Plus you can just have associations instead. So the way that action text works is you might have a blog post model. It has a relationship to an action text rich text, and that would just be an association to another table. You can delete that table and modify it and change its functionality inside your Rails engine without affecting the blog post. And that is really nice because you have a single place to interact with all of those as well. So for pay, we now have a pay customer table. And instead of storing that on your user model or your account or whatever, we now have it inside our own table. And when a webhook comes in, we can query a single table now instead of querying n number of models that you might have defined. So it really makes it a lot more consistent for you as the developer of the Rails engine to like work on your own code as opposed to trying to blend the user's code with yours. So it's probably the biggest, most important thing to pay attention to when you're trying to build something that integrates tightly to a Rails application. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. Looks like we have a quick question coming in from YouTube. I'm going to try and read this out real quick. It says, adding migrations through engine updates would actually update the schema and actually update the database on just updating the version of engine. I'm trying to understand what that question is asking.
Well, I guess it probably
so in general like the same question. So like or I think it's the same question. It's like when you release pay version 4, like you already had pay version 3 and pay version 3 had certain migrations, and when you release pay version 4, do you release a new migration that will add new columns or change the database?
Yes, and that is what you would do. Yes. So here's a good example. Active Storage originally shipped without certain columns, and I forget. It's like the service column or something like that. Service name. And what they've done is separated out the database migrations. So if you're installing Active Storage for the first time, you get the regular migration, which includes everything that is up to date. But if you have a previous old version of Rails and the old migration, it will give you these migrations to update you to that latest version and what it should be. So this one adds the service name, as it says in the name, add service name to Active Storage blobs. So it will go ahead and check and make sure that you have the Active Storage blobs table. It will check and see if that service name column exists because you might have added it yourself. And it will go ahead and make sure that all of that is correct. And what's cool is the Rails engines have a little helper for this. So when you generate your gem, your Rails engine, it comes with a rake task that will be called your gem name install migrations. And that's going to look inside the DB migrate folder. And then it will copy those over for your users. So you can basically ship new migrations, and then your users just need to run this command a second time or a third time or whenever. Whenever they do a major update, it should copy over the migrations that they need. And that will basically make that similar to how you would just run your own migrations, which is nice.
Okay. So another thing I'm thinking about as we're kind of going through this is assuming I can have more than one engine, which we can already do because you did mention that like Rails itself is like a composition of additional engines. Assuming that I can have multiple engines, should I be concerned about like conflicts? When I say conflicts, I can imagine what if my engine is reliant on some other gem, right? And your engine is reliant on the same gem, but a different version of that gem, right? Like, I think that could be like, I don't know, maybe there's like one way to consolidate. And also, what if my engine, again, I'm just in the realm of conflicts, what if my gem, you know, I don't know, writes to a certain table, webhooks, very generic name, webhooks, right? And then your gem has a webhooks table. And so now we're both writing to a table called webhooks, right? I mean, is there some type of namespacing or scoping that can happen that says everything, at least from a data perspective and even from a routing perspective, for this gem lives in this space? Or do you have to like be very specific with naming conventions and things like that to make that happen?
So yeah, two things. One is you will in your gem spec already set version requirements. So if you have two gems that require different versions of some dependency that's shared on both of them, you'll want to make sure that that's in your gem spec so that when you install them, it will say, hey, you need compatible versions of these two engines to make that work. So that's one thing. If you have dependencies that are shared between them, a common example of that is the OAuth libraries. You might have OAuth with GitHub and Twitter and Facebook and whatever. Those will all depend on different OmniAuth dependencies. And if those conflict, then you have to, fork them and resolve them or whatever the case is. And then when it comes to code stuff and data things, what you'll see here is that this migration for active storage creates an active storage blobs table. And if we go to the model for it, the models are actually all namespaced inside of active storage. So app models, active storage folder, and then we have blob. So the models are going to end up being namespaced accordingly. It also makes sure that the table name is namespaced in your database. So if you have any of the pay models in your application, what you will have is pay customers instead of just a customers table, which was probably going to conflict with somebody's application or merchants or payment methods or whatever. everything is namespaced. So as long as nobody else is using that pay namespace, it's all going to be safe. That is the main thing. You just need a unique name and namespace for your engine to keep everything inside of. And that is like the normal thing for any Ruby gem anyways. So you will have, when you create your Ruby gem, it will give you a module to work inside of. And we can see that here too. We have our module Blorg in the brand new empty Rails engine that we created. So inside of that Blorg engine is going to be namespaced. Engine will be used in multiple gems, so we wouldn't want that to be like a top level thing. So it's nicely organized for you. And that's really all you have to do is just make sure that your tables, your classes and everything stay within that namespace, and you're pretty much good to go. So
Okay, that makes sense.
When it comes to generating views from the engine, is that like, I know with Devise, right, you can say like generate all the views for me so I can go and edit those.
yes,
Is that built into like the engine system, or do you have to build that on
it
top?
is.
Or okay,
It's super cool. So if you have an engine, so a rail tie would be basically this without the app folder. But if you have an engine, it will automatically include the app folder when it's searching for views. So your Rails app is going to first look at your app folder and app views, devise, sessions new. So your Rails app can override those easily because it's like first in the path, like the search path. So Rails keeps track of the search paths automatically because you said, hey, we have a Blorg engine here or a pay engine. We're going to include that in the list of search paths for the views and controllers and everything else. So you can go ahead and drop them in to your Rails application to override the things from the gem. So it's just kind of seamless for you, which is really handy because you can just, modify stuff really easily and override it however you need. If you need to change the design, copy the file, voila, you're good to go. And that same thing applies to generators as well. And I think we may have a generator here. So Rails gems or engines and rail ties will have generators. So we have the emails views generator, and this will say that when you run the like Rails pay views, email views generator, it will go and look for this directory and it will copy over all of the files in there to your Rails application. So it'll grab the stuff from the gem and copy it into your Rails app. And that's really all these generators do is copy the files straight from inside the gem and put them in your Rails app. So that's how it overrides it. Just copies them from one place to the other and you're good to go. That's why these directory values here are exactly the same because they're in the same spot.
So you did have to like make that generator. It's right.
This is so this one you like run Rails G, and you'd need to do this in actual Rails application, but it would print out all of the like generators that are available.
Right.
One of the things that a Rails engine or rail tie will do is inside of your library, it's going to look for a generators folder, and you can put generators inside of that. So all of these will automatically be detected and registered and then be part of your Rails command. So when you run Rails generator or Rails generate, it's going to look at your Rails app, pick out itself and all the engines, look in those folders, then look for the lib generators folder. And you can use that to like create your own generators, or in the case of something like Rails JBuilder, that one overrides the Rails scaffolds to include JSON in them. And this one has the scaffold controller generator that overrides the Rails scaffold controller generator to include JSON in the controller itself in the JSON.jbuilder views. So you can build these to override the Rails generators themselves as well if you wanted to do that.
So you could theoretically inside of Pay have a controller for pricing And
Yes.
then you could say like, okay, here's a pricing table. And if you wanted to edit that yourself, you would just say like Rails G pay views, and that would copy all the views over. You would go in, update it. Okay.
Yeah, and we would probably end up doing like a pricing generator itself or something that you would give us maybe the ID of your pricing table. We could insert that into the HTML and then copy that over to your Rails app, and you'd be good to go or whatever. So yeah, lots of interesting things you could do with that to basically create those files automatically and do some magic to generate a pricing page in like one command.
Something that I've always found challenging is like when I generate the views for something like Devise, it doesn't have whatever UI framework I'm using. So it won't have Bootstrap, or it won't have Tailwind, or it won't have whatever. And so I'm always super annoyed that I have to start from scratch basically once I copy things over. So yeah, like how would you approach kind of building something that fits nicely every time you want to use views? But
it's tough. You would probably have to create separate views for every single framework, and you won't be able to tell it how to get Tailwind or Bootstrap or whatever CSS framework, because it could come from the asset pipeline, it could come from ESBuild or Webpacker or whatever you might be using for your front end. So your HTML you can easily drop in, but you would kind of have to say, hey, we assume you've got Bootstrap already here. We're just going to like have the HTML with all the Bootstrap classes on it. And that would work fine. And if you have any JavaScript that is needed, you might need to embed that or, have that some other way. One of these being the Tailwind CSS Rails library that DHH, I guess, just updated, which is cool. It has a generator and it will override the scaffolds and overrides like the form here with the all of the CSS and stuff for Tailwind. And your index page will have like a table or whatever, flex stuff like this. So if you did that, you would pretty much need to create like several different folders, probably, maybe different generator commands, or maybe the command has an option and you would pass in like, I want Bootstrap or Tailwind or whatever. And then your generator could decide, okay, they said Bootstrap, so we'll go into the templates folder and the Bootstrap folder, and then we'll have our copy of files there that we move over. Because I don't think you're going to want to put a bunch of if statements inside your HTML templates and try to like organize that. Because a lot of times your Tailwind or your Bootstrap's going to have different HTML layouts anyways. So you couldn't really make one template that supported both, really.
Totally.
If that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. That makes sense.
One thing that I'd love to see is any gymnastics that you've done, particularly around database queries inside of Pay, to paper over all the different database management systems that I know.
Yes.
Working to support.
Yeah, and that's one of the tough things. So like Pay is trying to support, SQLite, MySQL, Postgres, and we also support multiple payment processors, so they're not all the same, and we don't really want to create all these different tables that may be used sometimes for one or the other. So we try to consolidate them. One of the easiest ways is to try to consolidate them using a JSON or JSON-B column. So I know that we have a lib file here in Pay adapter, and this one allows us to check your database connection config and see if you're using Postgres or not. And we try to use the JSON-B column there. And if you're on SQLite or MySQL, then we'll use a JSON column. And then this just kind of helps us run the migrations and say, which column do we want for that type? And then from there, we have to, and I know Colin just worked on this with me, for querying those tables, they're all very different. So I think if we go into, yes, here we go. So inside this, we added this code right here to query the JSON columns between the different database versions. So Postgres and PostGIS use the double arrow, and this works to query those JSON columns. MySQL has a double arrow, but it doesn't work unless you have the $ dot before the name. So we were hoping that because they have the same operator, we could just have them all treated the same. Of course, you can't. This will just return nothing. And then SQLite just introduced the arrow syntax as well. And we're super excited about that. And we could have consolidated maybe that MySQL 2 and SQLite together. But it turns out that for backwards compatibility, the brand new Ubuntu version that came out in April doesn't have, it's one minor version behind for supporting that syntax. So we have to use the JSON extract instead. And the basically this arrow operator is a shortcut for JSON extract. And you'll see it also requires the $ dot at the beginning of your column name there, or your attribute in JSON. So we have to do some of these jumping through hoops that are on fire in order to make this stuff compatible. Unfortunately, the MariaDB stuff, which is like a fork of MySQL or whatever, they claim to be like fully MySQL compatible, but their JSON columns are actually text columns that are validated to be valid JSON. But they don't actually have the same operators. And so we've tried in the past to do the same approach here and support that, but it just didn't work. So maybe in the future they will fix that, but they used it as a text column in order for some performance reasons to make it faster, but apparently now you can't query it the same way. So it is not compatible, and I've wasted hours trying to figure out how to do an equivalent of that as well. And so, yeah, you get in the weeds real fast when you're trying to support multiple things like this seamlessly. And there's plenty of users using all three of these databases. So that, I guess, brings up one real quick thing, which is when we run our CI, we have a whole heck of a lot of different matrix of things where we need to test each database with each version of Ruby that we want to support with each version of Rails. So that means that for SQLite, we need to run it against 4 different versions of Rails and a single Ruby version. And that means that we've got to go modify all those, and we end up running 12 tests for SQLite, or 12 iterations of CI for that in Postgres and MySQL. So it keeps the CI busy because we have so many different permutations of those. And it will probably only get worse, but luckily we can drop Ruby 2.6 or whatever, Rails 5.2 whenever it goes end of life, and just only officially support the latest versions. So
it seems like that, doing those gymnastics around querying if the pause behavior is null is a choice that you're making as an engine maintainer, because it would be easier to just use this JSON blob for all the data related to a subscription rather than introducing this new column that would force everyone to run a migration, and maybe you have to figure out how to backfill, et cetera, et cetera. Okay.
Because some payment processors don't even support pausing at all. So we've leaned on things that are not very often queried. We'll put them in the JSON column. In this case, maybe in the future we will add a migration that will move this to a pause behavior column or something like that. But not everybody. Sometimes it's just pause is true or false. Stripe has multiple options for that. So we have to make sure that we don't go too overboard on tying it to one specific implementation because we're trying to abstract this stuff. So this has been our solution for now, because this, I think, is maybe one of the only things that we actually have to query in the JSON columns. And this is mostly just to keep this is mostly for convenience, because in reality, all of the pause subscriptions are technically active. So we could load all those. And in general, I want to display them all on the web UI, but maybe for like authorization of, does this user have access to the paid feature? Active without pause is a helpful query to make, so that we can say, hey, these are all the people who actually have access to that feature. Because if you're paused, we don't want to give you access to the paid features. So it is one that, probably could make sense to actually pull out into a separate column or something in the future. But it's always a trade-off of like, we'll end up running 100 different migrations if we're going to try to like sync every one of those different keys that Stripe may or may not change in the future. So the nice part is, with the JSON column, we add the attribute and we're done. And you upgrade the gem and you didn't even know that we added new fields. And one example of that is like all the Stripe tax stuff. We now sync all the line items, the discounts, the tax amounts, and all of that stuff just get dumped into the charge model, and you're good to go. And generally, you're not going to be querying on that, so it's all pretty solid. Just to jump in there. So here's a good example of lots of the different things that we store in the JSON column, and we can easily rename those in the future and whatever else, add new ones, drop ones, and it doesn't really affect the usage, which is nice.
Awesome.
So, quick question. I'm sorry. Yeah, something you want to say, CJ?
No, that was it. I was just, this is, I'm learning a ton. So
that's good. Hopefully everyone that's watching is learning a ton too. If folks that are still here with us, if you have any particular Ruby, any Rails engines that you really like or you think are really cool, go ahead and drop them in the chat, and we'll pop it up on the little screen, and we could take note of those. So we are running a little bit late on time. We have about like 5-10 more minutes before we gotta get back to the real world. Question I have for you, Chris, is there a use case where my engine needs to like talk to or like glean insights about how my main application is running? I know we spoke about like CSS stuff and assets and stuff like that, but like other than that, like is there like, I don't know, like anything that it needs to like functionally know? Like, can it call into my app and be like, hey, I don't know, I want to ask you a question or get like some information or figure out like the state of configuration or whatever the case is. Is that like a thing that people do?
Yeah, absolutely. A good example is actually in the Madman repo. We have a generator that will generate. So this is a little admin gem that I had worked on that looks at all of your database models and then creates an admin interface for them. So in our generator, we have it in the install generator, I believe. It will look for all of the models in your Rails app. So it will go find everything that has inherited from active record base, and it will check to see, as long as it's a real database record, not an abstract one or database table. And the has and belongs to many in Rails are kind of invisible, so you don't actually have any code to interact with those database tables. We skip those and look for any models that match that, and that's it. So we can look into that stuff from the Rails engine as well. And you can also like do, I think it's probably here in Pay. If we go into the engine, you'll notice that in the routing piece, we in our initializers are given the Rails app that we're integrating with, so we can actually go and interact with anything on that. So in this case, I'm saying, hey, the page gem is loading. You told me to auto mount the routes. So we're going to tell the Rails app, hey, we want to append this route, and it is going to be all of the stuff inside of it. So you have access to that. You can look up any configuration things. There's lots of cool stuff that you can do with that, like the I don't know if it's under Rails itself. There it is. SAS Rails is a good example of this, where it will go and it's a rail tie. Well, it might be under the SASC Rails gem instead. Let's pull that up. SASC Rails. SASC Rails. It will actually go and configure things inside of the Rails application itself and like change configuration values. So your engines can actually define their own config that's separate from, or it becomes part of the Rails application config. And it can also tell, for example, that the app generators should use these SAS templates by default. So it can tell and JBuilder does the same thing. Like, hey, we want to make sure your Rails app, when you run a scaffold, it includes for this SAS or SCSS files. JBuilder will say, hey, let's make sure that when you run the scaffold, we'll include the JBuilder stuff. You can do all kinds of integrations with the Rails configuration in the app itself. And so they really provide you like whatever functionality you could want to dig into to customizing the Rails app itself. So it's pretty cool.
Got it. That makes sense. Cool. I'm trying to think if I have anything else to ask you. Also, my mind is like partially melted because I'm just like absorbing so much information.
There's a lot to it.
Chris said he promised us a teaser, so
he did. That's right.
I'm kind of curious about how that's going, and also, I'm also selfishly interested in how your experience was integrating with metered billing.
Speaking of all that, you guys released version 7 of. Oh, I need to make a new release entry here in GitHub, but I released version 5, made a typo, and then released 5.0.1 to update Pay to the latest Stripe version 7 of the Ruby library. So that's been exciting. But recently we included all of the Stripe metered billing, Stripe tax, and things like that in order for Jumpstart Pro customers to have all that functionality like natively built in your app. We're all white labeled, so we're not redirecting you to checkout. So it's like a nice themed experience. And one of the first use cases of that is going to be the new Hatchbox. So we'll have metered billing. I've got my own account on a free plan here, but you can go through the checkout and we'll have the servers that you sign up with and everything will be kept track of. And I basically written, and I'll write some docs in the Pay docs about how to do this. But for every server that you spin up and shut down, we'll just keep track of the last time we recorded usage, and we can set up a cron job or whatever to run every hour, every day, every week, however often we want to check in, see how long your server's been running, give the Stripe subscription that update for the usage record, and then Stripe takes care of the rest for the metered billing stuff. So it's pretty awesome.
Was that challenging to integrate into Pay, or like, is there like a new usage record thing that's part of Pay, or?
So all we did, which I'm pulling up right here, all we did is we have a create usage record method, and you just give it the quantity and the action, and it's good to go. We will check to see if you have a subscription item ID given to us, we'll use that, but we'll just assume it's the first one. If not, and that's it. So in our case, like if you wanted to do a purely metered billing, this is like the simplest thing you could do. If you wanted to have like a base fee plus metered usage, then you would have to specify the subscription item ID on there in order to do that. And you would just probably save that in your, subscription or something, just to add that in there without having to query for it every time. But yeah,
that's what I did, something similar on the subscription item that you get back from Stripe, the usage type or the license type, one of them will say metered and one of them will say licensed. And then, so what I was doing was like find the subscription item where it's metered and store off that subscription item ID and like let's use that one, so I don't have to like worry about trying to like create a usage record for a non-metered.
Yeah, and if anybody wants to do a pull request, I think it would be a great improvement to have this check for, rather than naively just grabbing the first subscription item, go find the first metered subscription item in there. It should be available because I think when we sync a subscription item, where is that? Subscription items, somewhere in here.
Yeah.
Oh, here it is. Yep.
There we go.
Yep,
there it is right there.
So we set it to, let's see, attributes metered is true, but subscription items, we're not grabbing the usage type here. So it might be nice to also save the usage type in here so we have that. We're only grabbing the ID, price, metadata, and quantity. So that would be great to add usage type in here, and then we would be all set to be able to update that down below. So yeah, I saw your screencast on that, and I thought that was a great, solution for it, so that it's like, here we have the subscription ID and the item that we care about, because your monthly flat fee, you don't need that ever, but for this endpoint you do for the metered usage. So
cool.
Yeah,
Very
we'll have to go and update this so that it's even a little bit more robust, which would be great. So
super. Yeah, very, very cool. I think, just metered billing in general feels like a more advanced way to bill people, but also it aligns the value to your cost center. So as a business, like oftentimes, like in your case for Hatchbox, right? Like your cost center is like number of servers or whatever. And so being able to bill based on the number of servers makes way more sense. And so I do think like going forward, that'll be a more and more common thing that folks want to build. So the fact that it's already available and pay is phenomenal because people can go just create usage records.
And that's the cool part about working on a product outside of pay as well. It's like, if I need to collect tax, then, I'm going to go build it into pay. Then it's going to be a free improvement in Jumpstart for any customers there. And then I'm using it myself. So I work through all the bugs and whatever else and, have a real use case for it. And I can go back and include docs or whatever. And it was like, earlier today, I was telling Colin, like, I wanted a free trial that, we didn't need to create a customer in Stripe or anything, but I know we can do that where we can create a subscription without a card, without a payment method now, which is awesome. But I had set this up and we just had a little fake subscription inside of the PayGem for users. Whenever they create a new account, we just create a little fake subscription for 7 or 14 days. And then when that's over, we'll have them sent over to Stripe and we can create the Stripe customer and everything there. But we could also do it the other way too and just have it create the Stripe subscription right away and ask for the payment method later and fill all that out, which is awesome. So lots of different little ways to tackle that. But metered billing, I think, is a great option because you are really tied together there. The only tricky thing is if you're paying for stuff and the user doesn't, maybe their card doesn't work when you finally charge them, then you might be out that money or whatever. So that maybe is the one thing just to keep in mind if you go that approach. But in our case, like on Hatchbox, like if we lost a month of usage, it doesn't cost us anything because we're actually deploying to servers you're paying for instead of us paying for servers, and then we would lose money if you didn't pay us at the end. So we're nicely positioned for that, which I think is good.
Definitely a risk for sure. So
but I think if you get it to work well, that it's just such a nice thing that you're not paying for unused things all the time. And I think that is a pretty common situation with tiered pricing. You're just like, we have one extra, email subscriber, and now I get bumped up to this like several $100 more tier, and just because of one person, and it just doesn't seem like it makes sense,
Yeah, totally.
So
Yeah. Well, folks, I think we're at time. Chris,
Cool.
thank you again, because every time you come on, I feel like we learn a lot of cool and interesting stuff. So I definitely appreciate you.
Yes.
yeah,
and
thanks
then-
for having me.
Yeah, and then thank you for everyone that's here that's been like dropping comments and giving shout outs. And I feel like a lot of folks in the chat, their minds have also been blown. So you might need to give them a minute to catch up before we bring them any more dev chats. But again, thank you all for watching, and thank you for being here. We'll be back, I think, in 2 weeks. Is it 2 weeks?
Next week we're
Next
talking
week.
about.
Oh my gosh,
yeah.
what am I doing? We'll be not next week, Wednesday. We're gonna have some cool stuff about Stripe checkout, and again for the whole month of September too. So please come back. Please hit the subscribe button, hit the like button if you'd like first to have Chris back on and talk about some real stuff in the far future, because I'm sure you had some busy things that are happening soon. Let us know, and we could we can get that sorted out. All right. Thank you all so much.
Sounds good.
And we'll see you again the next time we have Stripe Dev Chats. Bye, folks.
Thanks a ton, Chris. Thanks
Thanks
everyone.
for having me.